Please feel free to contact the organizers. We can try to put together resources for you. If you go to the resource, the website for the conference, there is actually a resource page. There are a few documents there. One is a study I was involved with that looked at some of the tax issues that can answer, say, the question of how taxes differ across the Western grid, which would be exactly the competitors, if wind was going to move here or somewhere else. You can also find the E3 study. It is still available online. Just Google E3 Wyoming tax study and you will find their presentation and also comments on it. You can actually play around with the old statistical model that they used. They actually created a pro forma statement of how a wind farm's profitability looks as you change different assumptions. So again, thank you very much, Dan, for that talk. I'd now like to welcome our first panel. So our first panel focuses on wind development in the state. So I'll call up our panelists and Nathan, our moderator. So if you guys can make your way up to the stage, and then I will introduce Nathan. So this is actually the time where we actually get to take attendance and see if the storm actually stopped anybody from coming. And so far it looks like we actually made 100% attendance on this one. So welcome our first set of our first panel, I should say, and this is a group of developers looking at the opportunity in the state, and we wanted to ask them why Wyoming, and various questions that Nathan has provided. Nathan is our moderator, Nathan Wendt. He is the Vice President of the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs. If you're aware of them, they have been involved in several aspects of their think tank, looking at the issues around clean energy. They've been involved in clean coal technology. They've helped to try to lead partnerships with places like China, other areas where coal technology could be developed, also potential markets. They've now moved into the wind area, and they've created the Wyoming Wind Coalition, which is a group that is hoping to hasten wind development for the purposes of economic development in the state. And Nathan has headed that up. Nathan is a product of Jackson, I guess. But left us for a while to go work in the real world at Deloitte and other places. He has a distinguished record consulting. Many people know his father, David Wendt, and we've asked him to moderate this panel. And so with that, I welcome Nathan and look forward to the panel's thoughts and comments. So thank you.
Is this on? Thanks so much, Rob. Really appreciate it. Again, everyone, wonderful to be with you here today. We're going to be having a great panel on perspectives from wind developers here as it relates to Wyoming's wind energy future. As Rob mentioned, Nathan Wendt, I'm the Vice President with the Jackson Hole Center for Global Affairs. We're a bipartisan think and do tank. So we talk about things, but we also try to do something about it. And earlier this year, we created the Wyoming Wind Coalition, again, as Rob was mentioning. And thus far, we're 20 members strong. And the goals of Wyoming economic development agencies, Wyoming businesses, wind developers, all trying to work together to essentially hasten the role that wind can play for our state in new jobs, tax revenue, and also, as was discussed earlier today, opportunities such as bringing wind manufacturing to the state, what that would mean for economic diversification, or tapping into the growing reality of corporate demand for renewable energy. So that's sort of what the Wyoming Wind Coalition is all about. And we've covered a lot of earlier. We've covered some of the issues, the reducing costs of wind energy, obviously the fantastic resource here in the state, and others, and other topics. So I will now just sort of jump into some introductions with our panel. We're going to have about a 45-minute conversation here. And then we're going to open it up for about 30 minutes of Q&A. So be thinking about some questions that you would like to ask the panel, and hopefully we can have a good interactive session here. I'll start immediately to my right with Juan Carlos Carpio Delfino. Juan Carlos has been a manager and a director with the Delfino Group, starting back in 1982, Heavy Industries Group, where he's been involved with cement projects, paper products. And back in 2010, if I'm correct, Juan Carlos founded the Viridis, Wyoming group here in the state, of which Viridis Eolia is a member, a part of. And there are, that's the planned about 2,000 megawatts project here in the state. In 2011, Juan Carlos started to secure the lands and its superb resources to develop projects for the U.S. Department of Interior, BLM, and also from the state of Wyoming. And these would be guaranteed wind resources for the next 75 years. The Viridis group of companies started the NEPA process with the BLM in July 2016, and has been incrementally gathering all required environmental data for its compliance since 2011. Juan Carlos has a degree in managerial and administrative sciences from the Universidad Metropolitana in Caracas, and he speaks several languages. To his right, we have Paul Martin. Paul is the president of Intermountain Wind LLC, where he's responsible for all fundraising, strategic, investment, and operational decisions. In 2007, Paul founded Intermountain Wind to develop renewable energy and transmission projects in the Intermountain West region. Prior to founding Intermountain Wind, he worked as a commodities trader, risk management specialist, in addition to developing real estate. And Paul graduated from Vanderbilt University with a BA in mathematics, and he holds an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And Intermountain Wind is a developer of electrical generation and transmission projects based in Boulder, Colorado, and he's going to be talking some more about some of his projects right here in Wyoming. To his right, we have Aron Branam, who grew up in Houston, Texas, where he spent his youth enjoying the wilds of Texas and enjoying wide open spaces. In January 2010, Aron joined EDP Renewables, which is a global leader in renewable energy. And with EDP Renewables, he's a senior development project manager, and he's developed and built wind farms totaling over 450 megawatts across North America, projects from California to Texas to Ontario, including most recently completing in December 2016, just last year, a 77.7 megawatt wind farm in upstate New York called the Jericho Windrise Farm. In addition to that background, Aron has also been a research fellow at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and Aron earned a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Texas, and an MBA from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. And on the far end there, we have Ryan Jacobson. Ryan's with a power company in Wyoming, Chokecherra Sierra Madre project. And Ryan's a professional engineer who's worked in wind energy for 20 years, including designing and planning of international wind projects, as well as multiple projects in Wyoming for utility clients. Previously, Ryan led wind energy services for Black and Vetch, a international engineering and construction company. And Ryan has also performed wind turbine testing at the U.S. National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And he's also the chair of the American National Standards Institute's 810.21 subcommittee, which is developing an industry standard for the safe construction and demolition of wind energy projects. So we have a great panel with us here today to talk about the perspectives of developing wind energy here in the state. So I'm just going to start with some questions going down the line and start with you, Juan Carlos, and we can just go all the way down, and everybody can take a crack at it. First off, just please briefly explain your project and your background in developing projects here in Wyoming.
Well, thank you. Good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor. been developing this project for the past 7 years now. We started looking north from Venezuela, and we are an industrial group that's been in industry since 1908. And the dire situation in the country has forced us to look for opportunities outside the country. We've been involved in energy since 1994. We have 400 megawatts of natural gas energy with PSE&G from New Jersey as a partner. And we started looking into renewables down the road, looking at the perspective study, which coincides or agrees with most of what we've seen here this morning, as to what the trend of renewable energy going into the future as a very strong competitor in fossil fuels, and the policy implemented worldwide for going into renewables. Then you have the economics A101 reasons that we saw this morning that 10, 20 years ago was like seemingly a dream to think about renewable energy competing on a cost basis with fossil fuel, which is now a reality, and it's gonna, the slope on all those graphs is going to keep on steeping down. For example, wind energy, we saw this morning, is going down by 61% in the past only 6 years. Solar energy is even more, that slope is even steeper. It's gone down about 70 to 75% cost per kilowatt. So the rationale was to start looking at an opportunity. Basically, we started looking in Texas, Amarillo, in about 2009, 2010, and it was great wind, a lot of competition in the area, but the land issue was not so clear. So we took basically the wind map of the U.S. and said, well, what is the best, what are those blue spots of class 7 wind in the U.S. And the spot was, we're all here in Cheyenne, all of them. If you look at a wind map of the U.S., you'll see all those blue dark spots of 10 meters per second and up are, perhaps Laramie Range back here is the best wind in the U.S. on top of that mountain. So that was a logical choice, like in agriculture, where you have the best soil, you'll have the best crop, you have the least cost, because the input has to be the same per acre. So here's the same, you're going to invest in a turbine that costs the same more or less to build anywhere in the US, but if you have the best wind resource, your cost per kilowatt will be the lowest. So that's how we started going through the process of looking at a layered choice for the land, great wind, available transmission, no conflicts on cultural resources and other major environmental issues like sage grouse here in Wyoming. So we ended up with all those choices, ended up at Shirley Basin, and it's a good swath of land with on federal and state land. So we gathered around 90,000 acres of land that we have now secured. We're finishing up on NEPA, and we have room there for 620 turbines, roughly, which with the current capacity of the turbines being taken out to market, now we're talking at 3.4, 3.5, 3.6s, and then that gives the, we're looking now at 110 less turbines than we did only 2 years ago, but we're going from 1870 to 2200 megawatt capacity. That doesn't mean that it's going to be built in one, let's say, only one project. It's going to be subdivided into phases. We have 9 phases to grow the project, and we see it being built in the next 6 to 8 years, basically. We have a portion going for the RFP, and the Pacific Core just went out, just came out for the 2020 deadline, and we're shooting for that one, and we'll hope to make good on cost and basis, so Pacific Corp's customers get the best of it.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here. So Intermountain Wind has been developing projects in Wyoming pretty much since we got started. We started looking at a small project in southeastern Idaho, but quickly learned of the wind resource over here. And so we've been developing a handful of different projects over the last decade. Some have been successful and others have not. We've put projects on the shelf as we have learned of transmission issues or visual resource concerns or environmental species issues. And so we've been able to narrow our projects, the ones that we continue to focus on, to those projects that have the least impact and the greatest value. So we've got the Boswell Springs project that was mentioned before, that is 320 megawatts. It's at an extremely advanced stage at this point. We've executed our power purchase agreements, which are ultimately the sort of the final gate to getting the project built. And so we're very excited about that one coming online in 2020, construction probably beginning in 2019. And we have, as I mentioned, several other projects in the state. I think a couple hundred megawatts each on those. And so combined, it's a pretty sizable portfolio. The other projects are at earlier stages of development, but we will be working very hard to accelerate that so that we can have those projects ready for 2020 if possible.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Aron Branam. I work for EDP Renewables as a Senior Development Project Manager. A little background on EDP. We are an independent power producer focused only on renewables. We have about 5,500, at the end of this year, we'll have about 5,500 megawatts operating in the United States with a roughly equivalent number in Europe. So our operation is a little bit different, more similar to Juan Carlos than yours, but it's good that we have the spectrum up here. The company started development in Wyoming around 2004, and we've had several projects come and go over that time as the fundamentals that you look for in a state can change, transmission constraints, environmental issues, but what has remained constant, and I think what draws us to Wyoming and to continue to invest, is that we have the strong wind resource, but we also have, especially in my project, the Buffalo Bluff Wind Farm in Goshen County, an extremely supportive landowner base. And I think while we always look at these major issues, wind speed, transmission, marketability, for me, one of the most important is the relationships I have in the community, because they represent not only me as an individual, but my company. And just when we're talking about what makes a project successful and what we look for, I wanted to throw that one in because I think it's extremely important.
I'm Jacobson with the power company in Wyoming. PCW is a affiliate of the Anschutz Corporation and was founded to develop and build the Choche Sierra Madre wind project in Carbon County. That will be a 3,000 megawatt wind farm, roughly 1,000 turbines, or up to 1,000 turbines, on the Overland Trail Ranch, which is a 320,000 acre ranch, which is a mix of federal and private land. When completed, the project is expected to produce over 12 million megawatt hours of wind energy and represent a $5 billion investment in Wyoming. Construction for this project did begin last year with the beginning construction of our infrastructure, and we look forward to completing our project and bringing it online.
Awesome. Well, I think another question I'd like to just sort of take down the line here. From an economic diversification perspective, how do these projects look to benefit particular Wyoming communities in terms of jobs and revenue? When you look at these different projects, what will they mean?
Yes, we saw this morning on Dr. Garby's slides that the current, let's say, line of projects that we saw into Wyoming were roughly $8 to $10 billion in new investment in the state. So that gives us an image of the tax base. We're going to be looking at increased tax base for the state on a yearly basis, only in property tax. that's going to be very substantial, additional to the per megawatt, dollar per megawatt production tax. On the other side, you have the social economic impact of all this. We're dealing with a very small community at Medicine Bow, for example, and everybody's fired up on this project coming online. You have all the communities rooting for jobs and economic movement in the area. So in our case, for example, we purchased all the Medicine Bow School. We're planning on doing our center of O&M there and offices, and it's already giving an impact on the community, that gave income to the community to get a full year's allowance allocation on their state, duplicated state allocation for a year. And then they're going to have the additional impact. We're trying to get railroad spur at the area for unloading turbines and components there, reactivated. So that's a big project also for the community, so everybody's rooting for that. So in the end, these projects are going to bring huge amount of economic diversification, a huge amount of tax base, increased tax base in the state, and employment. You're going to have direct employment, indirect employment for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Either floating, meaning with construction, or permanent. We're talking about the technicians. There was a company from China that came in a couple weeks ago, last month, to start doing this program for training wind technicians for what we believe is going to be a wind rush in Wyoming. So we're going to need all the technicians and highly capacitated labor. So we're going to have many of the young people who are leaving Wyoming are now going to have perhaps some more allocation within the local economy to stay in Wyoming. So that's more or less our view.
So just to add to that, I guess one of the other things that we see as a major benefit is most of our landowners are local, and so they will receive pretty substantial portions of the revenue from these projects, life-changing amounts of money in a lot of cases. And these landowners are also job creators. They employ lots of people already, and they are very excited about the opportunity to use revenue from the wind farm to create more jobs. And it's not just jobs in the wind space, but it's ranching jobs, and it's other services that these large landowners need. So there's a considerable amount of multiplication effect that comes from all the money that comes into the state. So there's that. Also, I wanted to note that during construction, there is a huge amount of jobs that come into the state, and if we, as an industry here in Wyoming, can figure out how to have a sustained marketplace as opposed to what we've experienced in the past, which is a boom and bust tied to policy and transmission availability. If there is a consistency there, then the industry will continue to build more and more wind turbines on a consistent basis, creating a permanent workforce that's installing and repowering wind turbines. In addition to that, there's, as Juan Carlos mentioned, the tax base increases. The Boswell Springs project is located in Albany County. Albany County has sort of been left out when you look around the state as far as revenues from fossil fuels and other mining, but it has a substantial amount of wind. So this is an opportunity for Albany County, which has traditionally essentially been a client of the state, supported by the state. This is a chance for Albany County to get on their own 2 feet, and that ultimately benefits the entire state because it does not require money coming from Gillette, say, down to Albany County. So and as an example of that, more local specific examples from Boswell Springs, ultimately, we pay taxes, or the project will pay taxes, and the local governments get to, once they receive it, they get to spend it however they want. But during the ISD process, these communities do say what they expect to spend the money on, what their needs are that they've identified. An example of that is in Medicine Bow. The revenue from the sales tax is probably going to pave all the roads in Medicine Bow. They had to tear them all up about 5 or 10 years ago to replace the water system, and they didn't have the money to pave it again. So we'll pave the whole thing. That area of the county, both Albany and Carpio County, is underserved when it comes to emergency responders and police. One use of the funds might be that we see additional emergency response personnel stationed up there, more ambulances, more visits by the sheriffs up to the northern part of the county. Ultimately, this will all make all of the residents in that area much safer in their response time when they have a medical emergency will go down dramatically. But there's lots of examples like that. Those are just a couple.
Yeah, I'll try and fill in the gaps that you guys didn't already cover. I think it's important to remember that not every project goes forward as well, and I think everyone on this stage has experienced that. But there is a lot of funds that are put directly into landowner pockets before a project is even put into construction, and that's not money. You know, I can only speak for my company, and you guys can respond for yours. But my company doesn't ask for that money back. We're making an investment knowing that there is a risk. And those, I've seen personally that those funds can help tide over farmers and ranchers in years when beef prices are low or milk is low, and they value that. I'd also note that, you know, we talk about the direct construction jobs if a project comes into construction, but there is also a lot of trickle-down effects, especially during that period. I always like to joke that, you know, you want to be the guy selling beer during construction. That's really that's the big money maker. But the local shops, you know, they're used to serving 20 people on an average afternoon, are going to be serving 200. And so for that year or 2 or 8 or 9, depending on the scale of your project, there is a lot of trickle-down benefits that are achieved that are not direct to people who have signed a land lease agreement. And I think that's really important to remember, that the benefits spread beyond direct participants.
You know, speaking specifically with our project, you know, we do have a construction period of about 8 years that will see significant employment during that period with those construction jobs. For at least half of that period, we expect peak workforces of over 700 people. So that's a lot of revenue, a lot of job creation in that area. Once completed, we anticipate over 100, about 114 jobs, long-term operations jobs, will be created for Carpio County. As Dan Noble said here in his presentation, our project alone is anticipated to pay about $850 million in taxes over its construction and operations, about 2/3 of which will stay in Carpio County for the county and the communities within it to determine the best way to make investments with those funds to shore up its emergency response or infrastructure. So this is a chance for a county that already has some wind development to continue with that tradition and really put those funds to beneficial use.
Awesome. Sort of start up a little bit of an open conversation here. What are some of the developers, what are some of the issues that developers have to deal with here in Wyoming that are sort of specific to Wyoming? What are some of the what are some of the challenges and issues?
So I'll kick it off for us, guys. So having worked around North America and been in many different permitting regimes, I can say that I both favor and I'm not as keen on Wyoming's permitting regime, and I'll explain why that is. So at the state level, the Industrial Siting Council does a great job of laying out the permitting process. What we've also seen, though, is a secondary level of permitting at the individual county level, and those do not always jive with or are not consistent with what is provided by the ISC as our obligations as a wind developer. And that can make it difficult to navigate especially when you're building a project across county lines. One county can have regulations that are not consistent with the other. And so this creates, it eliminates one of the two things that we look for, and any industry is looking for, which is speed and efficiency. So anything that slows us down costs more money. That's money that could be used to reduce the price the power is offered at, or that can be funneled back into the community. So I'll just touch on that one topic, as consistent permitting at the state and local level is extremely important in bringing projects to fruition in a timely manner.
Just want to add on to that a little bit. Having gone through both the state and county permitting for our project, I'd like to say that I certainly concur that consistent policy is extremely important to any developer. We found that the state process was, while not overly easy, it was very well laid out, had a very specific time frame, and we really appreciated that it was not a nebulous or long stretching time frame to get through the process. It was very regulated, and I think very well done. We actually had a very good experience with the county process. We only had to deal with one county, however, and we thought that and again, just in our project, we thought that went very well. But coming back to it, clearly we need consistent, clear regulation on this issue in Wyoming to get that.
Yeah, in our case, we are basically on federal and state land, so our permitting process is more robust on the NEPA side and on the Eagle Conservation Plan, on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service side. So we look at it as a compliance process. It's been going on for basically 2 years. We see the most challenging process on the Eagle process, which is mostly defined, but there are some areas that are still gray within the regulation, so that needs to be improved. Our main concern is on that side, on the county level, and let's say planning level in Cheyenne and Carpio County. We don't oversee major issues there. There's also physical limitations on the ways of transmission. We see the big, huge potential that Wyoming has for producing wheat and exporting energy, but we need the pipeline to do that. It's as if you had a huge oil reserve, but you don't have an oil duct to carry the oil out of the production. So transmission is a big issue that, for example, Pacific Orbit's already starting to solve with the brand new announced investment. But there will be need for a lot more transmission if we are to develop the full potential of the state and in our project for that matter. So transmission is a big concern also. And also the tax policy, we talked about that in September last year, this year twice. These are humongous investments that need stability in time, and as costs are going down, prices are going down. So 2, 3, 4 years ago, you would have $60 PPAs with PTC and with the rest of the benefits. From $60, we're down to 20 or teens. We're talking $17, $18 PPAs nowadays. So given that, if you take into account that you already are paying $3.49 in a slide that Dr. Carpio put out this morning, if you combine all taxation within, say, dollars per megawatt produced, if you do the math, it's easy. If you have an $18 megawatt PPA, $3.50 on that, it's already 15% in taxes on the income, without taking into account financial cost return and all the rest of the financial math you have to do to make these projects feasible. So Those will be our three main concerns: federal permitting, transmission, and firm policy forward for allowing these projects to move on safe soil.
So I think one of the challenges that I've seen over the last decade trying to do wind in Wyoming is that the landscape has continued to change and evolve underneath our feet. So I grew up in southeastern Idaho and started this company trying to develop over there, but when I learned about the resource over here, I was excited about that because I have deep family roots here in Laramie. It goes back generations. But on top of that, Wyoming was known as a business-friendly state. You know, that, at least when it comes to wind, has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. We no longer have a level playing field with other states with the tax policy, and there's reasons for that. The permitting requirements have evolved dramatically and continue to evolve as the legislature keeps changing the ISD process. And all of these things are actively changing for us, and we're balancing that with what's happening at the federal level, which the most important for Wyoming, I think, is, you know, of course, massive amounts of federal ownership, but there's eagles everywhere in Wyoming, and we don't want to kill eagles. We want to be very good about locating projects in places that will minimize impacts to the eagles and their habitats and other threatened and endangered species. But we here in Wyoming are part, or the way the federal government does it, we're part of this Region 6 that actually extends all the way up into Canada. So if wind turbines are being installed in Washington and Canada, that's reducing the number of wind turbines that we're going to be able to install here in Wyoming. So if this is going to be, if Wyoming wants to take advantage of this, there's a ticking clock. You can't just put this off and say this is something that we'll always be able to do, because Fish and Wildlife Service will not allow that. The other major shifting landscape for us has been transmission. And when I entered the state all excited about getting to essentially come back home and have a career here, I was under the impression, as was all the developers, that there was plenty of transmission capacity. And everybody learned that wasn't the case, and the Pacific Corps quickly scooped up what was left and built it out. But so we ran into this drought period, and it was, I mean, a lot of developers had left the state because of the uncertainty for a lot of reasons, but the fact that we were, you know, pushing a Mack truck to try and get transmission to accelerate was extremely daunting. So now we've got Pacific Corps, the incumbent utility, building a transmission line for its own purposes, but it took them 15 years. And that typically, that would be one of the types of developers of transmission that you think would be able to move a little faster than others, because they just have a mandate for it, which can work both for and against it. But if Pacific Corps has been building these lines, and they've been working very hard to find the right paths out of the state with the least amount of impact, and they've been successful in doing that. TransWest is essentially using the same corridor, leaving the state to the south. And the common knowledge among regulators that I speak to, both state and federal, is that these exit points are very few in number. They are defined by trying to get around preservation areas, conservation areas, visual resources, species resources, all of that. And there really are not very many of these. And TransWest is squeezing in next to the Gateway South line in one of these, but the common knowledge is there won't be any more going through that same corridor. So unless something changes dramatically, once TransWest and Gateway West and South are built, there's nothing left. There's no other way to build another line to get out of the state. That's what the regulators say. So if Wyoming, as the largest beneficiary of transmission, so 1,000 megawatts of transfer capacity is built, Wyoming gets a piece of all that 1,000 megawatts, whereas any one developer gets a little bit. Wyoming is the beneficiary of transmission. So Wyoming is also in the position to force the issue to be sure that these pinch points, these corridors, and these transmission lines are maximized to provide for an industry here in Wyoming that does not stop in 2025. Because if nothing is done, those lines will get filled up and the industry dies again around mid-2020s. And say that inflection point that we heard about before of transportation electrification happens in 2030s, Wyoming's out. They don't get to participate. So all these lower wind resources are going to be developed, and Wyoming can't sell natural gas fire generation, it can't sell any more coal-fired generation, or wind or solar. So, I mean, this is a very daunting question because these are private enterprises trying to build transmission lines. But if the state does not get proactive and get involved, then they'll be left holding the bag. And there are examples of states that have been very successful with bringing wind to their state because they decided that they were going to take it upon themselves to invest in transmission. One example is Texas. Governor Perry there presided over the largest expansion of wind power of any state. And it was because the state decided that they were going to build the transmission with the belief that the generation would come. Now, we already have the generation. The queue in PacifiCorp's interconnection queue has exploded. There are so many developers that want to build now, it's unbelievable. We'll fill up these transmission lines that are planned very quickly. But then we run out. And so it's going to be, I would encourage either the legislature or the governor's office or somebody at the state level to form some kind of task force to look at this, to develop alternatives, to try and preserve the the growth of the electric industry in Wyoming. Because if nothing's done, it's just going to stop.
And I'll just add on to your note, because I worked in Texas during the development of they're called CREZ zones, competitive renewable energy zones. I facilitated the movement of approximately 18,000 megawatts from West Texas, where the wind resource is more robust, to the load hubs in Eastern and South Texas. And I think they did it, don't quote me on this, but it was between 5 and 7 years. So to say that it's not possible is not true. You just need to look south and show that with the right willpower it can be done. Just wanted to add a little color around that.
Actually, one other thought on Colorado. Colorado has done very well with expansion of wind and solar in their state. And it's also, they do have a mandate there, but it's also largely due to the fact that they encouraged Xcel to go out and build transmission with the same idea that you build it and the developers will come. And that is what happened.
We're just going to go back and forth now. I think it's also important to remember where you are geographically and the similarities of the Montana system to Wyoming and the expected decommissioning of the coal strip power plant and then the capacity that would open up on that line. So you have some major transmission lines going to the west where the load is in our region, one here in Wyoming and then a 500 kV in Montana. So it's not just as if Wyoming does it, there are other states that are equally incentivized very nearby, and their resources only slightly under what that of Wyoming is. So I think we can't rest on our laurels here that with great wind and then if we build transmission it will all happen. Everyone is pursuing this same end game, and you just can't let up the pressure.
All right, awesome. Well, I have lots of other questions myself, but we're about 30 minutes, so I thought I'd open it up to Q&A. So if you have a question, and you could identify yourself, and if possible, direct it to a certain member of the panel, that would be great. So any questions out there? Here we have one.
Amber Drasky, ROS Consulting. I'm just curious on the nuts and bolts, and Paul, this might be one because we're both familiar with Boswell. As far as land ownership, so if you come in on private land, the landowner still owns the land, and then you lease right of way. How does that work financially? I've just been curious on that.
Sure. So the typical arrangement, I would guess it's probably 99% of the wind farms around the country, is through a lease mechanism. So the developer has leased the right to develop wind and transmission on any particular piece of property. And in exchange, so that there ends up being a couple different periods in the lease. One is during development, where you've got biologists and meteorologists on the field and in the field looking at whether we can make this a real project and preparing for permitting. And there may be one type of income stream for the landowner during that period. And then once you move into construction, the land and operation, the landowner will either get a fixed amount for the acreage that they have encumbered, or they may get a royalty based on the gross revenue of the project.
In our case, we have a base payment based on the installed capacity and a royalty payment. So we provide a floor for what landowners will receive in any given year of operations. And then if it's a good wind year, which the production can change year over year, we want to share some of that with our landowners, and so it's a little bit of icing on top. So they get the greater of a royalty or a flat payment. But I would also add that we use rules of thumb a lot when we're talking about wind farm development, and you're only extracting about 1% to 2% of the entire leased area for the physical infrastructure that will be there. And so while we work very hard to mitigate any impacts that the design of the wind farm will have, once it's operational, you've preserved a large amount of open range that can be used for either ranching or for habitat. And so I think, especially in Wyoming, much like my experience in Texas, it's an incredibly compatible land use. Whereas even with renewable technologies like solar, it's comprehensive land use. It is the sole use of that property. And so it really provides, and I'm repeating myself, but the income from the wind farm provides a nice hedge against the volatility of crop and ranching commodities.
And often that hedge, the amount that comes from the wind project, it actually ends up being in excess of what they typically expect from their ranching operations. So that's why I say it's life-changing for a lot of landowners.
Hi, I'm Edward Simpson. Question for Paul. Based on your comments earlier about projected jobs for wind energy development in Wyoming, I'm curious if we have a sense of what proportion of those jobs are going to be kind of time limited, presumably the installation piece, as opposed to sustained jobs, presumably the operations, maintenance, and repowering part.
So there's definitely two different shapes to the job picture with a wind project, and really three different shapes. In the very beginning, during development, we've got biologists and folks like that, the geologists and archaeologists. But then construction is when the largest amount of workforce is being employed. And then it tapers off. I think Chokecherry was saying 110 for down from 700 jobs or something like that. That's approximately. So what I was referring to is, if we do go through, if there's no solution to the fact that there is a finite amount of transmission capacity coming to the state right now, then we're going to have a few periods where all of the folks that do construction of wind projects in the state are going to be very active for, I don't know, 3-5 years, something like that. But then we're topping out on the transfer capacity, and so no more wind is being built anymore. So then the only jobs left in the wind industry are those operations jobs, which is that lower level. However, if we can build more transmission capacity and plan for more transmission capacity, we can continue to build so that the constructors and the crane operators and road construction companies can continue to operate at full tilt throughout the decade and decades to come, as opposed to like big boom of construction, taper off for 10 years, big boom of construction. That's what we don't want.
Yeah, I would agree that it's best to try and keep a more level outcome for construction over the years. But it should also be noted that the jobs, even if they're small following construction, in Goshen County, where my project is, we may have 5, 7, 10 jobs permanent for the 20 to 25 year life of the wind farm. But there's no one in Goshen County offering $50,000 plus a year for the entry level position. And so I think we can't say that we're going to employ 1,000 people like a coal plant will, but we can employ people with high-quality jobs in areas that they will not otherwise be available. And so I don't like to draw a direct comparison, but I think it's important to know the benefits of each approach.
A couple of additional thoughts on that. First of all, on the long-term jobs, it also, well, it's a good high-paying job, it's a skilled job that also tends to target the younger end of the workforce, so it's a great opportunity for these communities to try to keep the younger members of their populations at home working these jobs, because they're jobs with a future and they're well paid. When it comes to the construction and the high cycle there, one of the reasons that we've spread out our construction like we have is to shape those peaks down and try to make that workforce lower and more sustaining than just 1 or 2 peak years of very high numbers and then gone, because we know that can be a high impact on communities.
Gentlemen, this is more of a comment than a question. My name is George Shereski. I'm with Oswald Construction, and I'm in charge of business development for our company. Thank you for coming and bringing your projects to Wyoming, not just on behalf of Oswald Construction, but on behalf of all of Wyoming contractors. I tend to be traveling farther and farther away from Wyoming looking for work. And in doing so, I mean, there's nothing ever is guaranteed that we're going to get work. But at least you are giving us an opportunity here in Wyoming to do the work for you. So we appreciate it.
I think we can all say that we would like that going the other direction. But I know that, built my recent project in upstate New York, my guys were coming from California and the Midwest. We need to pull more there needs to be a larger vacuum here in Wyoming and not letting people have to travel to either coast to find a construction job.
Yeah, I think we can speak to the experience. Power Company Wyoming started construction last year. We're actually used to use off-the-wall construction for civil work that we've begun. And what we found is that we've been successful in finding a large percentage of our workforce based in Wyoming, but as we've increased in our numbers, it's been difficult. So I think the more that these projects come in, the more the construction happens, the more of a draw that there'll be, the more of those jobs that the people will return to fill those jobs.
Yes, in our case, for example, we see, even though we might be working with a major contractor, the policy of the company is going to implement is to have this major contractor sub on local contractors. As locals, obviously, would have economics of scale within the state, and they will know the turf much better than any company coming into town. So our policy on that will be mostly local subcontractors and local hand labor to the possible.
Why don't we go with Mr. Gordon?
Thank you, and also thank you for bringing your projects to Wyoming. My question really goes, we talked about a couple of things on your panel. One was the difficulty of permitting, the time that it takes to get permitting done. Second one's transmission. And my question really goes to how do you capitalize these projects? Both you have capital that's at risk for a long period of time as you go through the permitting. But as you build out this and look at transmission, are you participating in the capital structure on transmission construction? Because it looks to me like that whole model is changing pretty dramatically, and I just wanted your view on how that all worked out.
Sure. We are self-funding the development of the project and the Express Transmission Project, which are somewhat separate entities. Going forward, as far as the long-term capital structure for them, I can say for the wind farm, we're definitely leaning more towards a project-specific financing with a thin split of debt and equity. For the transmission line, I'm not as close to that project, so I can't speak for certain, but I imagine it'll be a somewhat similar approach. So yeah, there would be equity as well as debt brought onto the project.
Yeah, so EDPR probably has the largest portfolio of development assets of the panel, and so we're constantly competing for capital for each one of our projects. You know, could be up to 70 at any time in the United States. We do self-fund all of those projects, but we have a very strict tiering system that a project has to reach a certain level of maturity before we can capitalize those costs just by sheer accounting treatment. When it comes to financing the project, we will either balance sheet finance our projects, or to take advantage of the production tax credit, we will engage with a tax equity partner. And then around year 10, the ownership structure will flip back to EDPR. So they're a little bit different, but at a very high level, that's how we would function.
So my company is a little different than the other three up here. We are not as highly capitalized as the rest of the folks. I started my company in partnership with my dad, and so my dad and I are essentially risking our money on any of these projects. And for us, it's a binary result. We will invest a couple $1 million into a project that may end up being worth zero, which has happened to us before. And on the other hand, with our Boswell Springs project, we invested a couple $1 million in that, and we were able to find what's called a sponsor. And the sponsor is somebody who is a larger company. They are willing to take lower returns in exchange for lower risk. So my company, what we do is we take all of that extreme risk at the very front end of the project, and we try to resolve as many red flags as we can to get the project to a construction-ready state. And at that time, we're going to bring somebody in. And one interesting aspect of that, as it pertains to Wyoming, that's a very typical structure throughout the industry. There's lots of folks like myself that do this, but what's known as an early stage developer. But in Wyoming, there's a rule at the ISD that if you don't have the financial capability to take this thing across the finish line, not recognizing that there is an extremely robust market for financing projects, and we've heard, the largest companies are still going and financing projects. If I don't have a big balance sheet, it makes it much more difficult for me to complete the permitting process. So it's another example where Wyoming is actually more onerous for permitting than many other states. And on that note, but on a little bit of a tangent, most people may not understand that if Trump did away with NEPA tomorrow, it really would not change our timelines that much. We've got to do in order to meet the Wyoming game and fish requirements, we have to do all the same studies that the BLM requires. So, and then we've got to go through the process of developing the application and going through the application process. All of that takes 6 to 9 months or more. And I have experience where it's taken much more than that. So I see very little daylight between the BLM process and the state process as far as it being onerous. Maybe the BLM has many more agencies, so it can be even more complex, but we still have to do all the same stuff and the timeline stays the same. So, that's back to the idea that your question about financing, we're putting all this money out there and we really don't know if this is going to happen. And it's a multi-year cycle to develop a project. And in the case of Boswell Springs, it was 10 years. We didn't know if we were going to get anything back. But the permitting is changing the whole time and becoming harder and harder and harder. And it's coming at us from the state level, from the federal level, and from multiple agencies at the federal level. It's not for the faint of heart. Or pocket.
Yeah, I just want to say, we're not against permit. I don't think any of us are against responsible development over here, but there is just something to be said about having a very clear and efficient permitting process that can help bring developers, both large and small, to the state.
Yes.
Yeah, we've gone on like this rally against permitting, but that is not the case. We just like efficiency.
So, and let me clarify, I think that the studies that we are doing are good. I mean, this is how we are making sure we minimize the impacts on all of these valuable resources that we're building on. And so it is, it's a good process, but it's not, when you hear people complain about the BLM, ISD is not that different.
So, Aron and Paul, you guys talked a lot about transmission capacity and maybe how that might get bottlenecked, and I know you guys kind of have different opinions on that, but I'm a grad student that works on the economics end of the DOE grant and a lot of this wind in Wyoming and its future. And I guess my question for all of you really generally as developers, who do you think will pay for increased transmission infrastructure? Say the transmission infrastructure we really need, especially for our wind potential to really take off. Who do you think pays for that? There's a lot of stuff going on in other parts of the state where there might be sort of these pay-sharing schemes where there are tariffs within a balancing area, and then even a portion of that might be attached to generators to help pay back what is spent on transmission infrastructure. And you guys have already talked a little bit about how you invest your own projects. So, I mean, who do you think should bear the cost of new transmission infrastructure, assuming that that can be organized and that takes place?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer because every situation is going to be unique. I think you have to look at the benefits that any given transmission project adds both to the reliability of the system as well as allowing for the generation that you're pursuing or whatever your procurement goals are. I don't have a great answer other than to say that we are not afraid of footing the bill for transmission that facilitates our projects. We'd rather work with the utility because they own and operate and understand the network better than anyone. But I think you've seen a couple of unique examples up here where if it is required, we will foot the bill to get our power to market. One way one way that we could address this on a larger scale is to move more quickly towards an energy imbalance market or the Mountain West states combining with SPP so that there's more transmission by which to move generation that may not be being used at any given time to load where it is required. So I think that's a very simple market mechanism without having to construct new transmission.
So and along those lines, for our Boswell Springs project, for instance, we are building a 35-mile transmission line that is a sunk cost to the project. But then we also need PacifiCorp to have completed their gateway projects to allow us to interconnect. So I think that oftentimes there's a mix of who's paying for all the transmission to make it work. In the case of Gateway, PacifiCorp is saying that we need to build the gateway in order to make our system reliable, and that system is a 6-state system. So they're really trying to balance out all of their disparate needs with this transmission. And so in that case, those 6 PUCs in those 6 states, in this state of PSC, they are responsible for being sure that the ratepayer is not getting charged for something that doesn't make sense. So as an example, a transmission line gets built in Oregon in PacifiCorp's territory. Typically that's going to get rate-based, and Wyoming consumers will end up paying a little bit for that. But that's part of building PacifiCorp's system. I think the same thing happens with this gateway, at least what's been proposed thus far for gateway. It's the system benefit, so all ratepayers throughout PacifiCorp's system are actually benefiting. What I suggested before about trying to, well, PacifiCorp can only go so far because they're tied to, they've got these PSCs and PUCs saying don't charge us too much. And they can't sort of speculate. It's just not in their mandate. They have to go off of this is what load growth has been, and maybe there's a great economic opportunity for somebody to do transmission, but they can't really take advantage of it. I think that that's why I was encouraging the state to actually take a proactive role and invest state funds in this type of effort, because if they did that, they could get a return on investment from the dollars they put into it, in addition to the fact that they're facilitating the increased generation capacity in the state, which also has the the royalty turning in the states, and then the tax revenues and all of that sort of thing. But they would be compensated for that investment from the generators as they pay to get the capacity that the state would then own. But there's, again, a lot of different ways to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, even over the last couple of years, I think you're seeing a new market, which is privatized transmission. A clean line is an excellent example, which is, I bring it up because Michael Scully was a former employee at my company, but I can give him a little plug. But I think the idea that private entities are willing to undertake transmission projects, knowing that they'll be able to pay them off through transmission service from generators, is a whole new model that we're just starting to touch on. It will take a long time to mature, but only in the past few years have I really seen it taking off.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm the Workforce Center Manager for Albany and Carbon counties, so we get the benefit of you. But I do want to ask a question on this part specifically with you, Ryan. Albany County has a 2.8 unemployment rate and Carbon County a 3.1. And we're looking at adding 100 jobs in an area. What is your recruiting process look like?
That's, so as we go through construction and we get to a point where we have infrastructure, the turbines we brought online, we'll be starting at that, as we get to that point, to reach out into the community to advertise for those positions well in advance of us wanting to fill them, because we realize that there is a training process. So we'll be looking for folks that already have gone through the programs to become skilled wind technicians, which is the bulk of that workforce. There are some other jobs in there too, as far as other types of maintenance sets that are required. So first we look to identify folks that live regionally and have those skills, and then we would, as we work through those possibilities, look to either incentivize folks to go get them or to help them go get those skill sets, or to some extent we will probably have a portion of that initial workforce coming in from other projects to bring some experience with the training and help train up the others as well. But clearly, we want to try to identify as many folks locally and regionally as we can, because we realize that those are the folks who are going to stay with the project. And for us, as the developer and owner, we want to find those folks, because for us to have a transient workforce that comes in and out does not benefit our project even more than it benefits.
Okay, and then we will take one last question over here before lunch. I'm Christy Thompson from Casper, president of Rocky Mountain Sheep Company. Just wondering, down the road, do you guys have to be bonded just in case your company goes bankrupt? And then we're left with kind of wind turbines out there that aren't being used. So do you have to reclaim if the trend changes or your company goes bankrupt?
Speaking for ourselves, yes, we do have to be bonded. Both through the industrial siting process with the state, that applies to state and private land, and through the right-of-way grant process with the BLM. We are required to post bonds. They're surety bonds, so they are held, money held aside, and they're based on the cost estimates to do the reclamation. So this is full decommissioning and reclamation money held aside. So should one day the owner of any project turn in the keys and just abandon the project, the funding is there to allow for the site to be completely decommissioned and reclaimed. And not every industry operating here has that requirement, but we do post surety bonds to cover that entire cost.
Yeah, the same is true for EDPR. Not only within Wyoming, but we typically bond all of our projects for decommissioning. I think the nice thing about a wind farm is that as long as the asset is making money, some entity would step in to run it until its full life. So there's less of a concern of a premature decommissioning of a money-making asset. But yeah, we do ensure restoration is covered should anything happen to our company.
One thing to add to that, so it is covered, for the full amount, and I think that it's even a little conservative in the state's favor, in that there's salvage value to these wind turbines. They're massive amounts of steel sitting in there, and it is an explicit carve-out that says that in calculating the size of the bond, we're not allowed to use that. So even though even though we're coming up with this massive amount that can decommission everything, there's still extra money there that will motivate whoever owns this project to go ahead and do the decommissioning. So there's very little doubt whether it's actually going to happen.
And I just want to add one thing, not on the financial part of decommissioning, but I think one of the benefits of a wind farm is that when you remove this facility, the land will look like what it did before in short order. Because you're removing the structure, you're taking the cap off of a foundation. Typically we leave roads in place because our landowners come to love them, being able to access, the back section. And so it looks like their farm within very short order after decommissioning. And I don't know, to me that's really important, to my landowners that's really important.
All right, well, with that, please join me in thanking our panel.